Philadelphia. It's a name that sounds serious, respectable, the kind of place where history wears a clean coat and clears its throat before speaking. You don't imagine chaos when you hear it. You imagine documents, signatures, men who believed deeply in liberty and wore wigs that suggested they also believed deeply in discipline. Philadelphia was the city of Quakers, gentle souls, pacifists, people who believed that moral order could be maintained through quiet restraint and firm eye contact. It was the city of the Constitution, the city where freedom was carefully drafted, debated, and preserved in ink that has aged far better than most human intentions. It was by reputation a city built on virtue, reason, and the comforting assumption that society could be made orderly if everyone simply behaved. And on paper, it worked beautifully. If you were to arrive in Philadelphia in the 19th century and remain in the correct places, the wide streets, the respectable squares, the buildings that faced the sun, you would see exactly what the city wanted you to see. Clean facades, churches with confident steeples, men discussing commerce and morality as if the two were naturally compatible. This was a city that looked you straight in the eye and assured you, calmly and politely, that things were under control. Philadelphia was very good at reassurance. Stand in the city center long enough, and you might begin to believe it. The architecture alone carried an air of moral confidence. Brick buildings stood square and upright, as if they themselves were trying to set a good example. This was a place that believed in structure, social, spiritual, architectural. Everything had a place, and everyone was expected to stay in theirs. From a distance, it was almost convincing, but cities, like people, are rarely what they claim to be when you get close. And Philadelphia, for all its quiet virtue, had an impressive talent for coughing politely while hiding something unpleasant behind a handkerchief. Take a walk. Just a short one. A few blocks away from the respectable streets, the air begins to change, not dramatically, not all at once. It doesn't announce itself, it simply grows heavier. The buildings lean a little closer together. The streets narrow, as if they're not meant to be examined too closely. And history, which had been speaking so confidently moments ago, clears its throat. This is where the city's voice lowers. Philadelphia in the 19th century believed deeply in God. It also believed deeply in order. And perhaps most importantly, it believed, almost religiously, that the worst things in society happened somewhere else, in other cities, in other neighborhoods, to other people. That belief was comforting. It allowed respectable citizens to sleep soundly, confident that the moral foundations of their city were intact. After all, if Philadelphia was the birthplace of liberty, surely it couldn't also be a breeding ground for misery. That would be inconvenient. And history, as we know, dislikes inconvenience. The truth was less cooperative. Behind the polished image was a city growing faster than it could manage. Immigration surged, labor shifted, wealth clustered tightly in some places and vanished entirely in others. Housing struggled to keep up. Sanitation failed quietly. Poverty didn't knock on the front door. It slipped in through the side streets and settled down without asking permission. But Philadelphia didn't panic. Panic would have been unseemly. Instead, the city did what many moral cities do best. It looked away, just slightly, not enough to admit neglect, but enough to maintain plausible deniability. After all, the churches were full, the laws were written, The ideals were intact. If suffering existed, and surely it did, it must have been the result of personal failings, poor choices, weak character, moral lapses. This was a very efficient way of thinking. It required no structural change and very little discomfort. From the city's perspective, the logic was flawless. Philadelphia was righteous. Therefore, anything unrighteous happening within it must belong to individuals, not the system. The city remained clean, the blame did not, and so Philadelphia presented itself as a model of American virtue while quietly developing the kind of contradictions that only grow larger when ignored. In respectable parlors, people spoke of progress. In backstreets, progress did not visit. What made this especially unsettling was how calm it all appeared on the surface. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden descent into chaos. Just a steady accumulation of lives that no longer fit into the city's preferred narrative. People who slipped through the cracks. People who were not invited into the story Philadelphia liked to tell about itself. And yet the story continued. Confident, well-rehearsed, and repeated often enough to sound true. Late at night, when the city quieted and the respectable lights dimmed, those contradictions became harder to ignore. Somewhere beyond the well-lit streets were places most citizens never saw and never wanted to see. Places where the promises of liberty felt abstract at best. Places where order existed mainly in theory. Philadelphia was not unique in this, of course. No great city is. But there was something particularly sharp about the contrast here. This was the city that taught the nation how to speak about freedom while quietly struggling to practice compassion consistently. And it did so with remarkable politeness. The irony is not cruel, it's subtle. Philadelphia didn't fail because it lacked ideals. It failed because it trusted them too much, trusted that ideals alone could carry the weight of reality, that if the words were right, the outcome would follow naturally. That virtue, once declared, would simply enforce itself. History rarely works that way. So when we talk about Philadelphia in the 19th century, we must hold two images at once: the city of principles and parchment, and the city of narrowing streets and quiet suffering. One proudly displayed, the other carefully tucked out of sight. From far away, Philadelphia looked like the promise fulfilled. Up close, it was already beginning to whisper a different story. One that did not shout, did not riot, did not demand attention. It simply waited, patient and unseen, for someone willing to walk a little farther than the city brochure suggested. And that, perhaps, is where the real history begins. When history takes a left turn and you take the wrong one. Cities rarely announce when they are about to change. There is no bell, no proclamation nailed to a door, no moment when someone clears their throat and says, "Attention, everyone. This is where it starts going wrong." Instead, change arrives quietly, incrementally, respectfully, almost apologetically. Philadelphia's turning point came disguised as success. Population growth, immigration, industry humming along with the optimism of a young nation convinced it had discovered the correct way to exist. People arrived in waves, some hopeful, some desperate, most somewhere in between. They came with accents, with skills, with empty pockets and full expectations. Philadelphia welcomed them, at least in theory. After all, this was a city built on principles, liberty, opportunity, the promise that effort would be rewarded. The city meant well, but meaning well and being prepared are two very different things. Houses went up quickly, too quickly. Structures appeared where planning had not yet arrived. Streets multiplied without much concern for what they would eventually carry: people, waste, despair, regret. Housing grew faster than infrastructure. Neighborhoods expanded faster than oversight, and moral confidence quietly outran practical responsibility. It wasn't malicious, it was efficient. Philadelphia grew the way ambitious things often do: forward first, consequences later. At first, everything seemed manageable. Crowded, perhaps, a little strained, but manageable. Cities have always been crowded. Crowding, people told themselves, was simply the sound of progress clearing its throat. But then something subtle happened. Temporary solutions became permanent fixtures. Short-term housing became long-term confinement. Makeshift neighborhoods settled in and refused to leave. History has a peculiar habit of doing this. What begins as an exception slowly becomes the rule, especially when no one is particularly motivated to reverse it. And so, the alleys arrived. They weren't planned. They simply appeared in the spaces no one had claimed responsibility for. Narrow corridors between buildings, pressed into service by necessity. At first, they were shortcuts, then shelter, then home. The city did not approve of them, but it also didn't remove them. Philadelphia preferred a middle ground, a polite distance. The alleys existed, but not officially. They were there, but not discussed. A compromise that allowed everyone to remain comfortable. And comfort, in a city like this, was a high priority. As more people arrived, the margins filled up. Those who found work moved outward, upward, toward light and space. Those who didn't stayed behind, settling into the shadows where rent was cheaper and expectations were lower. Over time, the difference between these two groups stopped being temporary and started looking structural. Philadelphia had developed layers. From above, the city still looked impressive. Commerce thrived. Churches multiplied. Industry pushed forward with the confidence of a nation that believed its future was inevitable. But below that surface, just out of sight, another city was forming. One that did not appear in celebratory speeches or civic paintings. This city did not bother pretending it was temporary. Eventually it needed a name. Naming something has a strange power. It makes it feel contained, understandable, almost manageable. If you can name it, you can point to it. And if you can point to it, you can reassure yourself that it is over there, not here. So Philadelphia borrowed a name. They called it the 5 Points of Philadelphia. It was a clever choice, a borrowed notoriety. New York's 5 Points was already infamous, already accepted as a kind of moral failure zone, dangerous, sordid, and safely distant in the public imagination. By invoking it, Philadelphia achieved something remarkable. It acknowledged the problem while simultaneously externalizing it. "We have one too," the name seemed to say. But only one. And it's contained. And it's already been explained. The comparison did a lot of work. It allowed people to talk about the area without talking about why it existed. It reduced a complex social collapse into a recognizable label. The problem wasn't systemic, it was geographical. Just don't go there. And most people didn't. The 5 points became a kind of moral quarantine, a place where everything unpleasant could be stored without disrupting the larger narrative of progress. Crime, poverty, addiction. These were no longer citywide concerns. They were local curiosities, confined to streets that respectable citizens had no reason to visit. This arrangement suited everyone involved except those who lived there. For them, the city's growth was not an abstract trend. It was pressure, crowding, competition for work that didn't pay enough to justify the effort, rent that rose faster than wages, buildings that decayed quietly without inspection or urgency. Philadelphia, after all, was busy. The city had institutions to build, reputations to maintain, futures to plan. Addressing the conditions of the poorest residents required attention, resources, and, perhaps most dangerously, self-reflection. It was much easier to assume that the people in these neighborhoods belonged there. And so, the language shifted. Residents of these areas were no longer simply poor, they became immoral, disorderly, intemperate. Their suffering was reframed as evidence, not of neglect, but of personal failure. This logic was remarkably effective. It transformed compassion into suspicion and charity into correction. If people were suffering, it was because they had chosen badly. If neighborhoods decayed, it was because the residents lacked virtue. If conditions worsened, well, that was unfortunate, but hardly surprising. The city, meanwhile, remained innocent. Late at night, when the noise softened and the day's confidence wore thin, these neighborhoods took on a different quality. Sounds traveled differently. Laughter, arguments, coughing, everything echoed longer than it should. The walls were close, the streets narrower, the sense of permanence heavier. These were not places designed to recover. What makes this period unsettling isn't the sudden appearance of misery. Misery has always existed. What unsettles is how seamlessly it blended into the background, how easily it was absorbed into the city's rhythm, tolerated rather than confronted. Philadelphia did not fall apart. It simply expanded unevenly. The respectable districts continued to function. Business carried on. Morality was discussed, debated, refined. Meanwhile, just a short walk away, lives were being compressed into smaller spaces with fewer exits. The city had taken a turn, quietly, efficiently, and most people didn't notice until they were already going the wrong way. And once you've taken that wrong turn in a growing city, it becomes surprisingly difficult to turn back. By the time anyone seriously questioned what had formed in those alleys and back streets, the answer was already inconvenient. The neighborhoods were established, the reputations fixed, the people inside them rendered invisible through familiarity. They were no longer newcomers, they were no longer temporary. They were part of the city, just not the part anyone wanted to claim. Philadelphia had not created a hell, not intentionally. It had simply allowed one to develop quietly, politely, and out of sight. And that, as history often demonstrates, is usually enough. The observers nobody invited. When a city decides not to look at itself too closely, it still needs witnesses. Not the kind who arrive with notebooks and deadlines. Not the kind who wear uniforms and issue orders. And certainly not the kind who shake hands, give speeches, and promised to look into it. Those people had already decided where not to go. The observers who entered Philadelphia's forgotten streets in the mid-19th century were not journalists, not police officers, not politicians. They did not represent the state, the press, or public opinion. They represented something far less fashionable and far more persistent. They were clergy. This was not because the church was particularly brave. It was because, in a city that had quietly designated certain neighborhoods as moral dead zones, clergy were among the few who still felt obligated to cross the invisible border. Souls, after all, were said to exist everywhere, even in places that respectable society preferred to classify as lost causes, especially there. The polite city walked around these districts the way one walks around an unpleasant smell in a narrow street, quickly, with eyes forward, and with the unspoken agreement that acknowledging it would only make things worse. The clergy did not enjoy that luxury. Their vocation required proximity. You cannot offer salvation from a safe distance. And so they entered. They walked streets that had learned not to expect visitors. They knocked on doors that were rarely opened for reasons other than necessity. They stood in spaces where the idea of public order felt theoretical at best. These were not dramatic descents into chaos. There were no sudden revelations, no theatrical horrors unveiled all at once. Just accumulation, the kind of misery that builds layer by layer until it becomes part of the architecture. What the clergy encountered did not align with the city's preferred self-image. This was unsettling but not surprising. Cities, like individuals, tend to curate their own reflections. Philadelphia saw itself as disciplined, moral, progressive. The reality in these neighborhoods was less flattering. And so the clergy did something that at the time seemed perfectly reasonable, and in hindsight feels almost radical. They wrote it down, not with the flair of a novelist, not with the urgency of a reporter chasing headlines, but with the steady, methodical attention of people who believed that bearing witness mattered, even if no one thanked them for it. These were not stories meant to entertain. They were records, accounts, observations offered in the hope that exposure might inspire compassion, or at least discomfort. Sometimes discomfort is the first step. One priest in particular, working through a mission on Bedford Street, began to document his visits with an earnestness that now feels almost excessive. He wrote not because he enjoyed the work, but because he believed silence would be worse. He described what he saw plainly, occasionally awkwardly, and without much concern for the reader's comfort. This was not a literary project. It was a moral one. And yet, ironically, these writings would come to read like something far darker than fiction. The priest was careful to explain his intent. He was not collecting horror stories. He was not trying to shock. He was asking for charity, financial, spiritual, human. The problem was that the truth, when unfiltered, tends to shock whether you intend it to or not. Readers encountering these accounts often reacted with disbelief. This can't be Philadelphia. This must be exaggerated. Surely this sort of thing happens elsewhere. The city's reputation made the stories feel implausible. How could such degradation exist in the same place that hosted refined lectures on morality and civic responsibility? How could such suffering persist in the birthplace of American ideals? The answer, of course, was that ideals do not enforce themselves. What the clergy recorded was not just individual tragedy, but a pattern. Lives worn thin by neglect, bodies weakened by hunger, alcohol, exposure, children growing up in conditions that quietly prepared them for failure before they had a chance to choose otherwise. These were not dramatic villains or romantic outcasts. They were people caught in systems that had no interest in catching them back. And this is where the discomfort deepens. Because the clergy, for all their compassion, were not neutral observers. They brought with them a moral framework that shaped how they interpreted what they saw. Poverty was often described alongside sin. Addiction was framed as moral collapse as much as illness. Suffering was understood through a theological lens that sought meaning as urgently as it sought relief. This perspective did not make their accounts false, but it did make them intense. Everything was charged with consequence. Every life seemed poised between salvation and damnation. Every failure carried eternal weight. For modern readers, this tone can feel severe, but in context, it made perfect sense. When you believe souls are at stake, understatement feels irresponsible. Still, even within this moral framing, something else kept emerging, something harder to ignore. The scale. These were not isolated incidents, not unfortunate exceptions. The clergy were encountering the same conditions again and again across multiple streets, among people who had never met but lived eerily similar lives. The repetition stripped away the possibility of coincidence. Whatever this was, it was bigger than individual weakness, and yet the city did not respond. The writings circulated among religious circles. They were discussed in meetings, referenced in sermons, shared among those already inclined to care. But they rarely pierced the broader public consciousness. Philadelphia had many ways of absorbing uncomfortable information without acting on it. One of the most effective was distance. As long as these stories belonged to missionaries and ministers, figures already associated with moral exaggeration, they could be politely acknowledged and quietly dismissed. Clergy, after all, were known to dramatize. Hell was a frequent topic. Misery was part of the job description. If they sounded alarmed, well, they always did. And so, the observers remained largely uninvited into the city's decision-making spaces. Their accounts existed, but they did not redirect policy. They informed charity, not reform. They inspired almsgiving, not structural change. This, too, was efficient. Late at night, reading these records now, the effect is different. Removed from their original context, stripped of the social buffers that once softened them, they feel unsettling in a quieter way. Not because they describe monsters or madness, but because they describe neglect with precision. They show us a city that knew, on some level, what was happening. The information was there. The witnesses were present. The words were written. What was missing was not awareness. It was willingness. The clergy walked into places the city avoided and told the truth as they saw it. They did not sugarcoat. They did not apologize for the discomfort. They believed that exposure might lead to mercy. What they could not predict was that their honest accounts would outlast the city's excuses. And now, long after the streets have changed and the names have faded, their words remain, quiet, unembellished, and disturbingly calm, waiting for readers who can no longer pretend not to see. Alcohol, the unofficial patron saint of the poor, alcohol was everywhere. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically, persistently, cheaply. You didn't have to look for it in 19th century Philadelphia. It looked for you. It waited on corners, behind counters, inside bottles that passed from hand to hand with the efficiency of currency. It required no introductions and offered no questions. It was, in many ways, the most reliable institution in the city. More reliable than housing. More reliable than work. And often more reliable than people. It was cheap. That mattered. It was strong. That mattered more. And it was always available, which mattered most of all. Alcohol didn't pretend to fix anything. It made no promises about tomorrow. It simply offered a temporary suspension of now, hunger dulled, cold softened, shame blurred at the edges. The future, whatever it was, could wait until morning. And when morning arrived unchanged, well, there was always another bottle. For people living on the margins, alcohol was not a vice so much as a coping strategy. A crude one, destructive in the long run, but brutally effective in the short term. When the world offered little comfort, alcohol provided something close enough. The city understood this on some level. Taverns multiplied alongside churches and often outpaced them. Where moral guidance hesitated, liquor stepped confidently forward. No sermons, no conditions, no moral assessments. Just relief, liquid, immediate, and indifferent. Philadelphia, despite its outward discipline, tolerated this quietly. Alcohol fueled labor, dulled discontent, and kept despair manageable. A sober population might ask difficult questions. An intoxicated one was easier to dismiss. And so, the bottles flowed. The clergy noticed, of course. How could they not? Every visit into the neglected neighborhoods carried the sharp, unmistakable scent of spirits. Cheap whiskey, harsh gin, mixtures whose exact contents were best left unexamined. Alcohol seeped into everything. Conversations slurred into arguments. Arguments into silence. Silence into collapse. One priest recorded an encounter that would have seemed almost mundane at the time. A man, clearly intoxicated, stopped outside the mission house during a religious gathering. He shouted, swore, unleashed a collection of oaths impressive in both volume and creativity. He cursed the world. He cursed God. He cursed the people inside who still believed that speaking softly might change something. There was nothing unusual about this scene. Drunken outrage was common. It required no audience and no justification. Alcohol stripped away restraint and left whatever resentment happened to be underneath. Eventually, the man wandered off. Homeward, as best he could manage, he locked himself inside his dwelling, a gesture that suggested some lingering attachment to privacy or safety. After that, the city forgot him. Not intentionally, just efficiently. Days passed, no one checked, no one needed to. In neighborhoods like these, absence rarely triggered concern. Silence was not suspicious, it was normal. People disappeared all the time, they moved on, they moved down. Sometimes they simply stopped moving. When the door was finally broken open by friends, acquaintances, perhaps people who had noticed the silence had lasted longer than usual, the scene inside was inconvenient. The man lay dead in the fireplace, curled inward, unmoving. His body had been there long enough for the rats to become involved. No one knew exactly when he died. Alcohol complicates timelines. so does indifference. The priest who recorded the incident admitted uncertainty. Perhaps the rats attacked him while he slept. Perhaps they waited. They are patient animals. Either way, they finished the work thoroughly. The detail lingered. It always does. What unsettles is not the violence. Nature has its routines. What unsettles is how unremarkable the death seemed to everyone else. No investigation, no outrage, no broader concern. A man had drunk himself into isolation, died alone, and been consumed by the city's smallest residents. And the city moved on. Alcohol made this possible. It softened the edges of horror until they blended into the background. It turned crises into private failures. If someone drank themselves to death, that was their choice, their weakness, their sin. The bottle was merely an accessory. This logic was comforting. It absolved the city of responsibility while maintaining its moral posture. Alcohol was the problem. Not poverty, not overcrowding, not neglect. The drunkard wasteth away his strength, as the sermons like to say. The city merely observed. But alcohol did not operate in a vacuum. It thrived in environments where options were limited and hope was rationed. For many residents of the 5 Points, alcohol was not competing with opportunity. It was competing with nothing. It filled gaps where stability should have been. It replaced meals, warmth, companionship. It became routine, ritual, refuge. And once it took hold, it rarely let go gently. The clergy tried to intervene. They offered food, shelter, guidance. They made their help conditional, which they believed was necessary. One must abandon the bottle to receive assistance. Salvation, after all, required sacrifice. This was reasonable in theory. In practice, it was complicated, because alcohol was not simply something these individuals possessed. It was something that possessed them. To demand immediate abandonment was to underestimate its grip. For many, the bottle was the last remaining constant. Taking it away felt less like rescue and more like erasure. And so many refused. They chose the bottle over the bed, the street over the shelter, the familiar destruction over an uncertain recovery. From the outside, this looked like madness. From the inside, it was consistency. Philadelphia watched these choices with a mixture of judgment and resignation. The city had rules. The city had morals. If people refused help, that was unfortunate, but not the city's fault. Responsibility, like alcohol, was easily reassigned. Late at night, the effects of alcohol became most visible. The streets filled with unsteady movement. Voices rose and fell unpredictably. Laughter slipped into shouting, shouting into nothing at all. Bodies collapsed against walls, doorsteps, curbs. Some did not rise again. These deaths rarely made headlines. They were not dramatic enough. A man found frozen. A woman found unconscious. Another body removed quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Alcohol blurred the line between accident and inevitability. The clergy, writing these accounts, struggled to balance compassion with condemnation. They believed deeply in moral responsibility. They also witnessed daily how thin that responsibility became under sustained pressure. Addiction was framed as sin, yes, but it was also clearly a symptom. They did not always know how to reconcile this. What they did know was that alcohol was winning. It outpaced charity. It outlasted sermons. It reached people faster than help ever could. And unlike the city, alcohol did not look away. It was present, persistent, and brutally honest in its effects. The irony is that alcohol functioned almost like a social service. It kept people numb enough to endure conditions that might otherwise provoke unrest. It absorbed despair and returned it as self-destruction. The city paid little for this service, and it worked remarkably well. Until it didn't. Until bodies accumulated. Until families collapsed. Until even the most disciplined denial could no longer pretend that this was merely a collection of individual failures. But by then, the pattern was established. Alcohol had become the unofficial patron saint of the poor, not because it saved them, but because it stayed. When institutions hesitated and society judged, the bottle remained loyal. It asked nothing. It promised nothing. It simply waited. And in the quiet hours, when the city slept and the streets whispered their truths, alcohol continued its work, steady, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Not a miracle, not a solution. Just another way the city learned to endure itself. The deaths that attracted no attention. In this part of the city, death was a private affair. No bells rang, no processions followed. No one paused long enough to ask why. People died the way they lived here. Quietly, inconveniently, and mostly out of view. There was no formal announcement when someone failed to wake up. No official moment of recognition. Absence was the only signal, and even that often went unnoticed. In neighborhoods where people moved constantly between rooms, between shelters, between states of consciousness, disappearance did not immediately suggest death. It suggested relocation, or arrest, or another bad night that would eventually resolve itself. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The city had learned to treat death as background noise. Bodies appeared in alleys, in stairwells, on doorsteps, behind taverns, inside rooms that had stopped being homes long before they became tombs. These discoveries were not rare enough to shock, nor common enough to inspire urgency. They existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, the kind history is very good at forgetting. One morning, a woman was found in a court off Baker Street. She had collapsed there during the night. Whether she stumbled, was pushed, or simply lay down because standing had become impossible was unclear. The details were already slipping away by the time anyone noticed her. What was clear was the result. Her throat had been cut. Her body had been partially eaten by rats. This detail, recorded with an unsettling calm, was not included for dramatic effect. It was simply what had happened. In these neighborhoods, rats were not metaphors. They were residents. They lived close, fed efficiently, and did not wait for permission. By morning, the work was already underway. There was no investigation that uncovered a compelling narrative. No suspect neatly identified. Violence here rarely offered clean explanations. It existed in layers: alcohol, desperation, proximity, indifference. Any one of these could have been the cause, or all of them. The city did not insist on clarity. What lingered instead was speculation about who she had been. People said she was not always like this, that she once had respectable connections, that she might have belonged somewhere else, somewhere cleaner, safer, more deserving of grief. The implication was clear. This death felt more tragic because it was imagined as a fall, not a beginning. She had potential, they said. She might have been someone. History loves that phrase. Had been, might have been, could have been. It is a convenient form of mourning. It allows us to regret outcomes without interrogating causes. The tragedy is framed as personal misfortune, not systemic failure. A life derailed by bad choices, not by narrowing options. And so the story ends there, neatly. The woman becomes a cautionary tale rather than a question. In these neighborhoods, death did not interrupt routine. It blended into it. People stepped around bodies with the same weary precision they used to avoid puddles or broken glass. Concern existed, but it was rationed. To care deeply about every death would have been unbearable. Better to remain functional. The clergy once again noticed. They wrote about these deaths with a mix of sorrow and resignation. Not outrage. Outrage requires energy, but a heavy awareness that something was profoundly wrong and yet stubbornly stable. What unsettled them most was not the violence itself, but the predictability. These were not sudden catastrophes. They were conclusions, endpoints reached after long, visible declines. The city had time to intervene, opportunities to notice, chances to act. It chose efficiency instead. Coroners arrived when required. Records were kept loosely, bodies were removed. The machinery of death functioned smoothly enough to avoid scrutiny. Each case was isolated, treated as an unfortunate but contained event. Patterns were inconvenient. For the people who lived there, death was neither shocking nor philosophical. It was practical. Someone was gone, a space opened, someone else might fill it or not. Life adjusted, it always does. There were no memorials, no lasting markers. The dead did not accumulate into a collective memory. They disappeared individually, which made them easier to forget. This forgetting was not cruel. It was adaptive. When survival requires constant attention, reflection becomes a luxury. Grief must be brief. Questions must be postponed indefinitely. The present demands too much. And so, deaths passed without ceremony. Late at night, when the city grew quiet, these absences were more noticeable. A familiar figure not slumped against a wall. A voice no longer heard arguing with itself. A body-shaped gap in the routine. These moments did not last long. Soon enough, something else filled the space. Another person, another story. Beginning its slow descent toward the same unremarkable end. Philadelphia, in its respectable districts, remained largely unaware. Or aware enough, but not curious. The city's moral imagination had boundaries, and these neighborhoods lay beyond them. The deaths there did not threaten the larger narrative of progress. They did not disrupt commerce or reputation. They were, in a word, manageable. The clergy struggled with this acceptance. Their writings grew heavier, their language more urgent. They tried to convey not just individual tragedies, but the cumulative weight of them. The sense that these deaths were not accidents, but symptoms. That something in the city's structure was quietly producing them. But urgency without authority travels poorly. These accounts reached people already inclined to listen. They did not reach those with the power to change conditions. And so, the deaths continued, steady, predictable, and largely ignored. There is a particular kind of horror in this. Not the sharp, immediate terror of violence, but the dull, grinding certainty of it. The knowledge that people will die, soon and quietly, and that nothing meaningful will change as a result. This is the horror of normalization. When death becomes expected, it loses its power to shock. When it loses that power, it loses its ability to demand response. It becomes part of the environment, tragic, yes, but stable. And stability in a growing city is often mistaken for success. The woman in the alley was mourned briefly, if at all. Her story dissolved into rumor. Her body was removed, her space reclaimed. The city exhaled and continued. She joined a long list of people remembered only in fragments, if remembered at all. Names faded, details blurred. Only the outcome remained. Dead, gone, unremarkable. History, when it finally looks back, tends to prefer revolutions, speeches, decisive moments. It struggles with slow tragedies, with deaths that arrive one at a time without spectacle, with suffering that never quite demands attention loudly enough to interrupt progress. And so, these deaths remain where they began, on the margins. Quiet, unceremonious, private, not because they lacked significance, but because the city learned how to live with them. Rats, the city's most successful residents. Rats did not drink. They did not stagger through the streets at night muttering regrets. They did not curse God or plead for mercy. They did not attend missions, sermons, or temperance meetings. They did not write constitutions. They did not debate liberty. They did not pretend. And yet, among all the living creatures in 19th century Philadelphia, rats may have been the most well-adapted. They understood the city better than anyone else. Where humans argued about morality, rats followed supply lines. Where institutions hesitated, rats acted. Where people looked away, rats leaned in, nose first, whiskers twitching perfectly at ease with what others refused to acknowledge. Rats flourish in cities not because cities are cruel, but because cities are careless. They thrive in the gaps between buildings, between responsibilities, between moments of attention. And Philadelphia, for all its moral confidence, had an abundance of gaps. In the narrow streets and alleys of the 5 Points, rats were not pests in the abstract sense. They were neighbors. They lived beneath floorboards, behind walls, under staircases. They traveled freely between dwellings, unbothered by property lines or social boundaries. In a city defined by separation, rats moved without restriction. They knew where food accumulated. They knew where waste lingered. They knew where bodies lay undisturbed long enough to become useful. This knowledge was not sinister, it was practical. When clergy wrote about rats, it was rarely with symbolism in mind. They did not need metaphors. Rats were simply there, present, active, involved. Their appearances in the records were frequent enough to suggest familiarity, not shock. The writers did not pause to explain why rats existed in such numbers. The explanation was obvious to anyone who had walked those streets. Garbage piled up. Sanitation lagged behind growth. Deaths occurred quietly and were discovered slowly. Rats responded accordingly. They entered rooms through holes no one bothered to repair. They nested in spaces that had long stopped being maintained. They fed on what the city discarded, sometimes food, sometimes bodies, sometimes both. This was not a breakdown of nature. It was nature adjusting efficiently to human neglect. In this sense, rats were not intruders. They were beneficiaries, and they were thriving. There is something deeply unsettling about the way rats appear in the accounts of death, not dramatically, not aggressively, but methodically. The clergy did not describe frenzied attacks or cinematic swarms. They described time passing, silence, then evidence, bones cleaned, flesh gone, work completed. Rats do not hurry, they wait, they assess, they proceed when it is safe. This patience mirrors the city's own. Philadelphia waited too. It waited for problems to resolve themselves. It waited for people to disappear. It waited for time to smooth over contradictions. In that waiting, rats and neglect worked in quiet partnership. The city did not intend to feed rats. That simply made the conditions ideal. What makes this particularly uncomfortable is that rats did not discriminate. They did not distinguish between the respectable poor and the disreputable, between the drunk and the sober, between the fallen and the merely unlucky. All bodies were equal to them, all spaces navigable. In a city obsessed with moral categories, rats were refreshingly indifferent. They were not cruel, they were not malicious. They did not judge. They responded to availability. When bodies lay unattended, rats arrived. When waste accumulated, rats multiplied. When neighborhoods were abandoned by oversight, rats claimed them. If anything, rats were reliable. This reliability unsettled the clergy, not because rats were monstrous, but because their presence exposed how predictable neglect had become. The rats did not cause the misery, they followed it. Their abundance was a measure of how thoroughly the city had withdrawn. In more respectable districts, rats existed too, of course. Cities always have rats. But there, their presence was controlled, trapped, removed. A nuisance, not a feature. In the 5 points, rats were woven into daily life. Children grew up knowing how to avoid them. Adults learned to ignore them. Fear gave way to resignation. This normalization is important. When rats become ordinary, something has gone wrong long before anyone notices. Late at night, when the streets emptied and the lamps flickered weakly, rats became more visible. They moved openly, confidently. They crossed paths without hesitation. Humans stepped aside, not out of terror, but out of familiarity. The city's most vulnerable residents had learned a hard lesson. Confrontation was rarely worth the effort. Better to adapt, better to coexist, better to survive quietly. And so rats prospered. They outlived residents. They inherited spaces. When someone died alone in a locked room, rats were often the first to arrive and the last to leave. They did not announce the death. They did not report it. They simply made use of it. This efficiency disturbed later readers more than it disturbed contemporaries. At the time, it was simply another unpleasant fact among many. Today it reads like a grim indictment, not of the rats, but of the system that allowed this to happen repeatedly, without intervention. The rats were not hiding. They were not secret. Their presence was widely known. And yet nothing changed. Because addressing rats would have required addressing what fed them: sanitation reform, housing reform, poverty alleviation, oversight, investment, responsibility. Those were expensive. Rats were not. It was easier to accept rats as part of the environment than to question why they flourished so well. Easier to blame the filth than to ask why filth was allowed to accumulate. Easier to kill rats individually than to dismantle the conditions that sustained them. And so the city chose management over transformation. In this sense, rats were the city's unintended success story. They adapted perfectly to Philadelphia's contradictions. They benefited from growth without planning, from morality without accountability, from ideals unaccompanied by infrastructure. They required no speeches, no policies, no charitable appeals. They simply lived. There is a quiet irony in this. The city that prided itself on rational order had created an ecosystem where the most rational actors were animals, responding to neglect. Rats did not debate. They observed and acted. They followed evidence. They exploited opportunity. One might almost admire the clarity, if it were not so revealing. The clergy did not linger on rats because they enjoyed the image. They mentioned them because ignoring them would have been dishonest. Rats were part of the story, a recurring presence. A reminder that death and decay were not abstract concepts here, but daily realities shared by humans and animals alike. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect. In these alleys, the boundary between human life and the city's waste stream blurred. People became, in death, another resource to be processed quietly and efficiently. Rats did not cause this dehumanization, but they made it visible. They showed what happened when people were left unattended long enough. Philadelphia, in its polished districts, would have been horrified by this depiction. Rats were embarrassing. They suggested disorder. They contradicted the image of a moral city. But rats did not care about image. They thrived anyway. And as long as the city continued to avert its gaze, rats would remain its most successful residents, unburdened by guilt, untroubled by ideals, and perfectly at home in the spaces no one else wanted to claim. Women, the night, and bad choices. Women moved through these neighborhoods differently, not because the streets were kinder to them, quite the opposite, but because the dangers arranged themselves with a particular attentiveness. The night watched women more closely. Corners lingered, doorways remembered. Every step carried an assessment that men rarely had to make so consciously. Where to stand, where not to stop, who to avoid noticing you. In 19th century Philadelphia's forgotten districts, being a woman meant learning the city's darker rhythms early and well. Respectability was a fragile thing here, less a social status than a temporary condition, easily lost and almost impossible to regain. And once lost, it did not return politely. The clergy wrote about women with a tone that hovered uneasily between sorrow and judgment. They spoke of fallen women, a phrase that implied a sudden drop rather than a long, exhausting slide. It suggested a moment of failure, a single misstep, rather than a series of narrowing choices made under pressure. History likes clean metaphors. Reality rarely cooperates. One woman appears in the records not because she did something spectacular, but because she had run out of places to go. She lived in a cow stable, not as an eccentric choice, not as an experiment in rustic simplicity, but because it was the last space that tolerated her presence for more than a few hours at a time. The stable was part of a larger building. In front, people cooked, ate, and carried on with the small routines of ordinary life. In back, 3 cows and a horse stood knee-deep in filth, generating warmth, smell, and, unintentionally, shelter. This woman slept among them, not because she preferred it, but because no one had yet forced her out. There is something deeply unsettling about this arrangement, not because it was shocking, but because it made sense within the city's logic. Animals were assets. They had value. They belonged. A woman without income, protection, or sobriety did not. She was tolerated only so long as she did not become a problem. Death, inconveniently, tends to create paperwork. When the owners feared she might die there, they removed her. Not out of cruelty, but practicality. Better she perish somewhere else. This too was efficient. The clergy encountered her shortly after. She was not young, though she was not old. Her appearance suggested decades she had not lived, an acceleration of age brought on by exposure, hunger, and constant vigilance. Alcohol hovered around her like a second skin. They spoke to her gently, offered help, shelter, a bed, a chance to survive the night without sleeping in filth. She listened, and then she refused. She clutched a bottle hidden beneath a greasy shawl, the last possession she guarded fiercely. The condition for assistance was simple: abandon the alcohol, accept sobriety, accept structure, accept rules. She declined. This refusal baffled the observers. Why choose the street over a bed? Why cling to the thing that was killing her when help stood within reach? But this question misunderstands the nature of choice in such circumstances. Alcohol was not merely a habit, it was a defense against cold, against hunger, against fear, against memory, against the long, quiet hours of night when danger sharpened and kindness disappeared. Sobriety, for her, was not relief. It was exposure. To sleep without alcohol meant feeling the pain fully, the fear fully, the shame fully. It meant being present in a body that had been worn thin by survival. The bottle dulled these sensations just enough to make existence tolerable. Not good, not hopeful, but tolerable. From the outside, her decision appeared irrational. From the inside, it was consistent. She chose the known destruction over the unknown discipline, the devil she recognized over the salvation that demanded too much, too quickly. And so she left. She dragged herself along the street, bottle in hand, returning to spaces that would not question her priorities. A cow stable, a doorstep, a corner, places that asked nothing and promised nothing. The next day she was found again, this time on the steps of a burning building. How she arrived there was unclear. Alcohol blurs causality. The fire may have drawn her for warmth, or she may have simply collapsed where she stood. The police intervened briefly. She was taken to a station house. Within hours, she was dead. There was no dramatic climax, no moral resolution, just an ending that felt inevitable in retrospect and preventable in theory. Women like her appear repeatedly in these records, not as individuals with full biographies, but as fragments, encounters, moments where intervention almost happened, where help hovered close enough to be visible, but not close enough to be grasped. Their stories rarely end well. This is not because women were weaker, it is because the margin for error was smaller. Men could disappear into anonymity. Women attracted attention, wanted and unwanted, and attention in these neighborhoods was rarely protective. At night, vulnerability multiplied. Alcohol became both shield and trap. It dulled fear but attracted danger. It softened the present while sabotaging the future. For women, this balance was especially precarious. Intoxication invited violence, yet sobriety invited despair. Either way, the odds were not generous. The city, meanwhile, framed these women as moral failures, proof of decay, evidence that discipline was necessary. Their suffering reinforced the belief that charity should be conditional, limited, cautious. Better to withhold help than to enable vice. This reasoning was tidy. It also ignored the reality that vice was often the only thing enabling survival. Late at night, reading these accounts now, it is difficult not to notice how frequently women are described in terms of what they might have been: respectable, useful, honored. The implication is that their value lay in proximity to a life they no longer lived. Their actual existence, the nights endured, the calculations made, the risks navigated, receives less attention. History once again prefers the hypothetical. What lingers is not the failure of individual women, but the failure of a system that offered them choices shaped like traps. Abstain immediately or be denied help. Submit fully or be left alone. Reform yourself overnight or accept the consequences. For someone already exhausted, this was not a choice. It was an ultimatum. And ultimatums, when delivered to people with nothing left to lose, rarely achieve the desired effect. The woman in the cow stable did not die because she chose alcohol. She died because the city offered her no safe path away from it. Her death was not an anomaly. It was a predictable outcome in a landscape where survival demanded compromises that eventually became fatal. Philadelphia did not see her as a reflection of itself. She was an outlier, an unfortunate case, a warning. But warnings only matter if someone is listening. And in the quiet after midnight, as the city slept and the streets resumed their familiar patterns, women like her continued to move through the darkness, making choices that looked bad in daylight but made sense in the long, cold hours before morning. Not because they lacked reason, but because reason alone was not enough to keep them alive. Families unraveling in silence. Somewhere in the city, a woman was crying. Not loudly, not in the way that draws attention. Just enough to release the pressure and then stop, because there were things that still needed doing. A child to quiet, a pot to check, even if there was nothing inside it worth checking, a door to listen to, waiting for footsteps that might arrive gentle or might arrive angry. Somewhere else, a child was hungry. Not starving in the dramatic sense, not yet. Just hungry often enough that hunger had become familiar. Familiar enough to be ignored when possible and endured when it wasn't. Hunger here was not an emergency. It was a condition, something to work around. And somewhere nearby, a man was drinking, not celebrating, not mourning, just drinking, because it was evening, because the day had ended without improving, because the bottle did not ask questions and the family at home asked too many. None of this made the newspapers. There were no headlines for these moments, no editorials, no calls for reform sparked by a single tear, a single empty stomach, a single man leaning heavily against a bar. Tragedy here was too repetitive to be newsworthy. It did not explode. It eroded Families did not collapse all at once. They thinned. They frayed. They learned to function around absences, emotional first, physical later. The husband who drank did not necessarily disappear immediately. He was there technically. His body occupied space. His presence filled rooms with tension rather than comfort. He worked sometimes. He promised occasionally. He returned home with just enough familiarity to prevent complete separation and just enough instability to prevent peace. This was not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It was exhaustion playing out slowly. Alcohol, once again, did its quiet work. It softened the edges of responsibility. It dulled shame. It created the illusion of rest without delivering it. Men drank because work was brutal, because wages were low, because dignity had become negotiable. They drank because they could not articulate disappointment without sounding weak, and alcohol offered an alternative language. Their families paid the price. Wives learned to manage unpredictability. They became experts in timing. When to speak, when to stay silent, when to hide money, when to hide children. They developed instincts that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with survival. Children absorbed this as atmosphere. They learned early which moods were dangerous and which were merely unpleasant. They learned when to disappear into corners, when to make themselves useful, when not to ask questions. This education was unintentional but thorough. The clergy encountered these families regularly, not in moments of crisis, but in states of prolonged strain. They wrote about women sitting quietly, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, children clinging without speaking, men absent in ways that could not be measured simply by location. These were not dramatic scenes. There were no screams, no broken furniture, just a heavy stillness that settled over everything. And because it was quiet, it was easy to ignore. The city preferred loud problems, riots, crimes, public disorder. Those could be addressed with force, policy, or at least statements. Silent suffering offered no clear entry point. It did not threaten public order. It did not interrupt commerce. It stayed inside, so it stayed invisible. Families unraveling did not challenge Philadelphia's self-image. In fact, they reinforced it. The narrative remained intact. Individuals failed, families struggled, morality weakened. The city itself remained righteous. Concern could be expressed without responsibility being assumed. This logic was neat. It was also devastating. When a family collapsed entirely, when a mother disappeared, when a father died, when children were scattered into institutions or the streets, the event was treated as an outcome, not a warning. Another unfortunate case. Another lesson about the dangers of intemperance, but rarely a lesson about wages, or housing, or exhaustion, or despair. Late at night, these stories feel heavier because of their familiarity. There is nothing exotic here, nothing unusual, just patterns repeating with minimal variation. The same arguments, the same silences, the same slow dissolutions. A child growing up too fast. A woman growing tired of hoping. A man drinking to forget that he once imagined more. The city did not intervene because intervention required listening, and listening required admitting that these families were not anomalies. They were products of the same city that celebrated its ideals so proudly. That admission was inconvenient. And so, family tragedy remained private, contained within walls that were already too thin. managed through endurance rather than assistance, passed down quietly, like an inheritance no one asked for. The clergy struggled to write about this without sounding accusatory. They wanted to inspire compassion, not blame, but their language sometimes betrayed frustration. How many times could the same pattern be observed before it ceased to be coincidence? How many children had to grow up in hunger before hunger became a civic issue rather than a personal one? How many women had to weep in silence before silence itself was recognized as a problem? Their writings circulated, but their impact was limited. Philadelphia was a city busy, congratulating itself. Progress was visible. Industry thrived. Respectable neighborhoods expanded. The future looked bright, at least from a distance. In the shadows, families continued to come apart. And because this happened gradually, predictably, and without spectacle, it was easy to pretend it was unavoidable. The kind of suffering that comes without noise rarely demands response. It simply settles into routine. Children from these families often followed familiar paths. Some drifted into labor early, others into the streets, some into institutions that promised discipline in place of care. Their lives bore the imprint of decisions made long before they were capable of making any themselves. The city watched this happen with a mixture of concern and detachment. Charity addressed symptoms. Morality addressed behavior. But the underlying conditions, the pressures that made family life so fragile, remained intact. This is the tragedy of repetition. When suffering repeats often enough, it stops feeling urgent. It becomes background. Something to be acknowledged politely and then moved past. The city learned to coexist with broken families the same way it learned to coexist with rats, with alley deaths, with addiction. By normalization, late at night when the streets quieted and the city's confidence dimmed, these families were still there, still struggling, still holding together what they could. Their tragedy did not announce itself. It whispered, it lingered, it repeated, and because it repeated, it was rarely heard. Philadelphia did not need to silence these families. It simply needed to let them speak only to themselves. A hell that didn't need fire. There were no red demons. No rivers of lava cutting through the streets. No screams echoing from beneath the ground. No theatrical punishments designed to frighten the righteous into obedience. Philadelphia did not require any of that. Its version of hell was far more economical. Cheap alcohol, well-fed rats, and a city that mastered the art of looking away without appearing to turn its head. This is what makes the story so unsettling. Not that suffering existed, history is full of suffering, but that it existed so calmly, so consistently, so politely. There was no singular villain to blame, no moment when the city fell, nothing dramatic enough to interrupt dinner conversations or civic pride. Philadelphia did not become hell by being cruel. It became hell by being efficient. In this city, damnation did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with routine, with habits, with systems that functioned just well enough to prevent collapse, but not well enough to prevent harm. People were not cast down. They were allowed to slip. And once they slipped far enough, they simply stopped being seen. This is the kind of hell that does not announce itself. It doesn't need to. It blends in. It looks like normal life from the right angle. It sounds like quiet streets at night. It smells faintly of whiskey and damp brick, and something organic you learn not to identify too closely. The city continued to operate, markets opened, church bells rang, new buildings rose. Progress did not stop to ask who it stepped over. What the clergy recorded and what history later struggled to absorb was not chaos, but order. A grim, functioning order. Alcohol numbed despair efficiently. Rats cleaned up what was left unattended. Families absorbed damage quietly. Death removed people from the margins without paperwork that might attract attention. Everything worked. That, perhaps, is the most disturbing part. Philadelphia's hell did not punish sinners dramatically. It wore them down, slowly, methodically, without ever admitting it was doing so. It offered just enough relief to prevent revolt, just enough structure to avoid collapse. People did not burn. They faded. This kind of suffering does not inspire immediate outrage. It inspires fatigue. And fatigue is far easier to manage than anger. A tired population does not demand justice. It demands sleep, or drink, or silence. And the city provided those. Late at night, when the streets emptied and the lamps flickered, this quiet hell revealed itself more clearly, not in sudden horrors, but in absences. Someone not where they usually were. A voice missing. A doorway empty that hadn't been before. These gaps did not alarm anyone. They were expected. Philadelphia learned to accommodate loss the way it accommodated growth, incrementally without reflection. Each disappearance was small enough to ignore. Together they formed a pattern no one wanted to name, because naming it would have required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would have required responsibility, and responsibility would have been inconvenient. So instead, the city maintained its posture, upright, moral, forward-looking. It spoke confidently about liberty while tolerating conditions that quietly stripped it away from those least able to defend it. This was not hypocrisy in the cartoon sense. No one stood on balconies laughing at the poor. No secret council planned misery. The cruelty here was passive, procedural, almost bureaucratic. Philadelphia did not hate its poor. It simply did not need them. They did not contribute to the image. They did not enhance the narrative. Their suffering did not threaten stability, so it was allowed to continue. In many ways, it was useful. It served as warning, as moral lesson, as proof that discipline mattered. And so, the city remained convinced of its own goodness. The clergy who had walked those streets and written those words were left in an uncomfortable position. They had seen too much to accept the city's self-portrait, but too little power to change it. Their accounts existed as evidence, quiet, persistent, and easy to set aside. Over time, even those writings faded into obscurity. The neighborhoods changed, streets were renamed, buildings torn down. The physical traces of this quiet hell were erased or renovated into something more respectable. History moved on, but the pattern did not disappear. It merely shifted location. That is the final unease of this story. Philadelphia's hell was not unique. It was instructive. It showed how easily a city built on ideals could tolerate suffering without abandoning those ideals, simply by redefining who they applied to. It demonstrated that you do not need fire or demons to create something deeply inhumane. You need indifference, structure, and time. Lots of time. The people who lived and died in those alleys did not see themselves as participants in a grand moral failure. They were just surviving, making choices that looked bad in hindsight but felt necessary in the moment. Drinking because hunger hurt. staying silent because noise attracted danger, accepting conditions because resistance seemed pointless. Their lives did not end with revelation, they ended with exhaustion, and the city slept through it all. This is why the story lingers, why it feels heavy even now, long after the rats have moved on and the whiskey brands have changed. It reminds us that the most enduring forms of suffering are not imposed violently, but permitted politely. That hell does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it yawns, sometimes it looks exactly like a functioning city at the end of a long day. Philadelphia did not burn, it endured, and perhaps that is what makes it hardest to forget and hardest to sleep with once you've finally seen it. Good night from a city that never screamed. And so we arrive at the quiet end, not the kind of ending that slams the door or demands applause, just the kind that settles in, like the final sound a city makes when it believes no one is listening. Philadelphia, after all, was never interested in dramatic conclusions. It preferred things tidy, civil, wrapped up without too many questions, which is fitting. Because the story you've just heard does not want to shock you awake. It wants to follow you into sleep, to sit gently at the edge of the bed and remind you, politely, that history's most unsettling moments are rarely loud enough to warn us. No monsters leapt from the shadows tonight. No fires consumed the streets. No villains twirled mustaches under gaslight. Just systems that worked, habits that repeated, and a city that mastered the art of not noticing. There's something almost admirable about it in a deeply uncomfortable way. Philadelphia didn't panic, it didn't collapse, it didn't lose faith in itself. It carried on, confident that tomorrow would look enough like today to require no serious adjustment. And for many people, it did. For others, tomorrow never came with anything new at all. History tends to flatter cities that survive. It rewards endurance, not introspection. And so Philadelphia kept its reputation, its monuments, its carefully curated memory. The alleys changed, the names faded, the lessons remained optional, which brings us quietly to you. Lying there, listening, safe enough, curious enough, just awake enough to wonder how many other places have looked exactly like this, reasonable, moral, functional, while something essential unraveled just out of frame. Don't worry, this isn't a warning. Warnings are loud. This is more of a suggestion, a gentle reminder that comfort and cruelty can coexist quite peacefully, provided no one insists on connecting the dots. But tonight, you don't need to solve anything. The rats have gone back to their corners. The bottles are empty. The streets are quiet. History is finished speaking for now. So take a breath. Let the city fade back into the dark, where it's always been most comfortable. If something about this story lingers, that's normal. Unsettling truths tend to do that. They don't chase you. They wait. Sleep well. And if you dream tonight, may it be of well-lit streets, honest questions, and cities brave enough to look directly at themselves, even when it's inconvenient. Good night, and thank you for listening.